We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of Nepal, based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of Nepal and its addendum. These documents, together with the additional information that will now be provided by Nepal, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mani Prasad Bhattari, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, Permanent Representative of Nepal to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva, to present additional information on the review. Your Excellency, you have the floor for a video message.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor for me to address the Council today as it considers Nepal's UPR outcome report. The third cycle of the UPR of Nepal took place on the 21st January 2021 during the 37th session of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review. The Nepali delegation was led by the former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pradeep Kumar Gyawali. During the session, 98 UN member states participated constructively in the interactive dialogues and put forward altogether 233 recommendations to Nepal for consideration. We commend their assessment, comments, questions and recommendations put forth during the review. I thank all the states as well as civil societies and stakeholders for their constructive engagements during the UPR of Nepal. My delegation endeavored to respond to almost all thematic issues raised during the session. My delegation takes this opportunity to thank the UPR Secretariat and Troika members, India, Burkina Faso and Argentina for their hard work and dedication to prepare the outcome report of Nepal's UPR. Madam President, after having received the recommendations, the Government of Nepal convened several rounds of discussions with the relevant ministries and agencies to finalize Nepal's position using a participatory and consultative approach along with the National Human Rights Commission and civil society organizations. We are pleased to state that most of those recommendations were already being implemented and some of them are in the process of implementation. Of 233 recommendations, Nepal accepted 196 recommendations, which makes 84%, and noted the remaining 37 recommendations. With regard to the noted recommendations, the Government of Nepal views that they require further assessment on the existing implementation capacity, including development of requisite legal, policy and institutional infrastructures, along with commensurate financial resources. On the recommendations to ratify disarmament-related instruments, Nepal supports time-bound, total and complete disarmament of all weapons of mass destruction under effective international control. Likewise, the recommendations to ratify the remaining international human rights instruments and other international instruments, the Government of Nepal intends to build further requisite legal and institutional foundation and capacity before joining additional instruments. Although Nepal is not a party to the 1951 Refugees Convention and its Protocol of 1967, for decades it has been providing shelter to thousands of refugees on humanitarian grounds. Nepal is abiding by the principle of non-refoulement. The Constitution of Nepal has guaranteed equality before law and the right to equal protection of law in order to abolish legal and factual discrimination based on ethnicity, gender and caste. It also ensures the rights against untouchability and discrimination based on origin, caste, tribe, community, profession, occupation or physical condition. The Constitution fully guarantees religious freedom to all people and prohibits discrimination on the ground of religious faith. Every person is free to choose, adopt, profess or practice religious beliefs. However, to ensure full enjoyment of religious freedom by every religious denomination, conversion by force or undue influence or inducement is prohibited. The Constitution also guarantees the freedom of expression and opinion, in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Nepal is committed to implementing existing legislation on domestic violence and harmful practices. Madam President, the National Human Rights Commission of Nepal, an independent constitutional body, is accredited as A category institution for fully adhering to the Paris Principles. It exercises a wide range of investigatory, supervisory, directive, and recommendatory powers for the promotion and protection of human rights. Other independent thematic commissions on women, Dalit, indigenous nationalities, Madhesi, Tharu, and Muslim communities have been actively working for the promotion and protection of rights and interests of these specific communities. The government has recently appointed commissioners to various commissions, including the National Human Rights Commission, in an inclusive manner following the existing legal provisions. We are committed to maintaining their independence and equip those commissions with the requisite resources for their effective functioning. I am pleased to inform that in its recent annual budget, the government has increased the monthly social security allowance by 33%, which is being provided to the elderly, single women, Dalit, persons with disabilities, destitute, indigents, and people belonging to the ethnic group on the verge of extinction. Social security and special protections are recognized as fundamental rights of senior citizens. The government has planned to expand the coverage of contribution-based social security schemes to self-employed, contractual, and daily wage workers in informal sectors as well. As a mountainous and agricultural country, Nepal is vulnerable to the disproportionate effects of climate change. To deliberate on critical global issues, the government of Nepal has initiated a multi-stakeholder global dialogue forum, Sagarmatha Sambal, named after the world's tallest mountain, known as Mount Everest. I am glad to inform the Council that the first edition of this dialogue, focused on the theme of climate change, which was postponed due to the pandemic, is now scheduled for 4 to 6 October 2021. We also stand firm on our commitment to addressing remaining issues of transitional justice in accordance with the Comprehensive Peace Accord, directives of the Supreme Court, relevant international commitments, concerns of the victims, and the ground realities. We regard democratic governance, public participation, and social inclusion as vital components towards equality and non-discrimination. Representation of women, indigenous nationality, Dalits, Madhesi, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized and disadvantaged communities in the state machinery has been ensured by adopting inclusive principles. We continue our efforts in the bilateral and multilateral fronts for the safety and well-being of Nepali migrant workers. Nepal is committed to the promotion and protection of the rights of children, including preventing child marriage and child labor. We attach great importance to the work of special procedures mandate holders. We have been regularly responding to their communications. We look forward to welcoming the Special Rapporteur on the right to food and the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. The visit of the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights is scheduled for September this year. Madam President, I would like to update the Council on the COVID-19 situation and response in Nepal. As the world continues to grapple with the effects of the pandemic, it has severely impacted livelihoods, economy, public health, and social security systems in Nepal. The government of Nepal has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic through measures such as prevention, control, isolation, quarantine, and treatment, and has adopted various health and safety protocols in compliance with WHO guidelines. Nepal was able to control the first wave of the pandemic with low death rates. We also inoculated vaccines to our elderly population and frontline workers as we received support from our neighbors India and China, as well as through the COVAX facility. So far, only 2 million to 587,873, which is 8.5% of the first doses, and 752,110, which is 2.5% of the second doses of vaccine have been administered out of the total population at this stage. To cope with such emergencies, the government in its yearly budget has announced financial support and enhanced facilities to equip hospitals with critical health infrastructure and medical equipment. Despite our continuous efforts to control the pandemic, Nepal was confronted with the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic starting from mid-April, with increased infection and death rates as compared to the first wave. To deal with the unprecedented surge of COVID cases, we appeal to the international community for their support for life-saving medical equipment, supplies, and vaccines. We appreciate our neighbors, friendly countries, including the development partners, who have been providing generous support with emergency life-saving equipment and medical supplies that were critical in controlling the dire situation. We also appreciate China for its recent support of vaccine doses, which are being administered to the needy population. My delegation underscores that the vaccines are the only means that could control the situation before the next wave could emerge. Hence, we appeal to the international community for concerted global cooperation and to redouble efforts to produce vaccines and immediately release their surplus doses to low-income countries including Nepal and ensure their equitable availability as a global public good. Madam President, Nepal is committed to building an egalitarian society founded on proportionate, inclusive, and participatory principles to ensure economic equality, prosperity, and social justice, and by eliminating all types of discrimination. The 15th National Development Plan, which is currently under implementation, aims at promoting inclusive economic growth, creating broad-based foundation for prosperity, and incorporates SDGs for the timely achievement of the overarching national aspiration of prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali, while at the same time reaching the milestones of LDC graduation by 2026 and middle-income country by 2030. I would like to assure the councils of Nepal's commitment to implement the recommendations that it has accepted through the formulation of UPR Implementation Action Plan. Nepal truly regards the UPR process as a unique, highly constructive, and cooperative mechanism of the Human Rights Council that promotes dialogue, cooperation, transparency, and mutual learning through the sharing of good practices and experiences in ensuring the universal respect, promotion, and protection of human rights. We look forward to a constructive discussion today. I thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with paragraph 13 of Human Rights Council Resolution 16/21, I will now give the floor to Mr. Top Bahadur Magar, Chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission of Nepal. You have the floor by video message.
Honorable Chair, all the delegates from Nepal and member states, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to represent the National Human Rights Commission of Nepal at this session. I would like to express my gratitude to all the recommending states and the government for accepting most of the recommendations. At the outset, I welcome Nepal government in its efforts to enact important laws for the enforcement of fundamental rights, and also urge it to formulate necessary regulations and create effective mechanism. However, responses to Commission's recommendations are not encouraging. Only 40% is fully and 37% partially implemented so far. This has continued the risk of increasing impunity. The Commission's amendment bill tabled in the Parliament must comply with Paris principles for ensuring its autonomy and independence. The transitional justice process should conclude without further delay, and its mechanism has to be made effective. Trust trustworthy and victim-centric. The Commission strongly reiterates to adopt special measures to eliminate all forms of discrimination and violence prevailing against women, children, and marginalized groups. Due to the COVID pandemic, Nepal is being severely affected. Therefore, the Commission stresses the government to urgently manage health services, including vaccines, to all people indiscriminately. Finally, I am pleased to share, Your Excellency, that the Commission is closely working with thematic commissions, civil society organizations, UN agencies, and international communities for protection and promotion of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I regret to note that the quality of the sound was not appropriate for interpretation, and therefore we couldn't have this statement interpreted into other languages. I will now open the floor to member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review. The speaking time has been set at 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states, and the first speaker is India with a video statement.
Madam President, India warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal for the adoption of the report of the working group on its third Universal Periodic Review that was held on 21st January 2021. It is noteworthy that the review witnessed substantive participation, with as many as 98 delegations taking the floor and making 233 recommendations. India was a member of the Troika for UPR of Nepal. We appreciate that 196 recommendations have been accepted by Nepal, including 4 recommendations made by India. We also appreciate the constructive engagement by the delegation of Nepal during the review, a reflection of the strong commitment Nepal attaches to the UPR process. India takes note of Nepal's progress in realization of economic, social and cultural rights and welcomes its accession to the protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the UN Convention against transnational organized crime. We warmly congratulate Nepal for its successful review and wish it success in their efforts for implementing the accepted recommendations. Thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to Indonesia on Zoom. Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We appreciate the constructive engagement by the delegation of Nepal during its review. We note with appreciation that Nepal has accepted most recommendations addressed to them, including all 3 recommendations from Indonesia. We encourage Nepal to fully implement all accepted recommendations to further strengthen human rights promotion and protection in Nepal. Mr. Vice President, Indonesia supports the adoption of the UPR Working Group report on Nepal by the Council. Indonesia will also continue supporting the contribution of the UPR as a cooperative mechanism, including efforts to strengthen the UPR to support implementation of states' commitment in the promotion and protection of human rights for all. We wish Nepal every success in the implementation of the results of the UPR. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Iraq for a video statement.
Mr. Chair, we thank the delegation of Nepal for the comprehensive review on the situation of human rights. Iraq participated in the discussion of the report and submitted recommendations on human trafficking, slavery and sexual exploitation of children, as well as efforts to promote equality. We express our appreciation for the acceptance by Nepal of our recommendations. We recommend the adoption of the review of Nepal and commend Nepal on the acceptance of the majority of recommendations submitted to it as a reflection of its commitment to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Malawi on Zoom. Malawi, you have the floor. I understand Malawi is not available. The next speaker is the Maldives by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the delegation of our fellow SAARC member country Nepal to this meeting and thanks them for their presentation today. The Maldives wishes to express its appreciation to Nepal for its commitment and constructive approach towards the UPR process. We further commend Nepal for accepting majority of recommendations it has received during the third cycle of the UPR. We also acknowledge Nepal's efforts in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights, in particular the implementation of the 15th National Development Plan to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We are pleased to note that Nepal has accepted the 2 recommendations made by Maldives to engage vulnerable populations in the development and implementation of the climate-resilient adaptation plans and to provide training for law enforcement agencies on the implementation of the National Penal Code and Criminal Procedure Code. We thank the delegation of Nepal for their continued efforts in addressing the challenges outlined during the UPR process, and we request the Council to adopt the UPR outcome report of Nepal by consensus. We wish Nepal every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Pakistan for a video statement.
We thank Nepal for presenting its update on the accepted UPR recommendations. We commend Nepal for accepting majority of the recommendations, including ours. We appreciate Nepal's commitment to advance national human rights agenda aimed at improving livelihood of its people and creating an enabling environment for the realization of their human rights. This commitment is well reflected through multiple legislative and administrative measures, including implementation of National Human Rights Action Plan and strengthening of the Human Rights Commission. We wish Nepal every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendation and request this Council to adopt the UPR outcome report with consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Malawi on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President. Malawi welcomes Nepal's progress since the last UPR and the promulgation of this constitution in 2015. My delegation notes efforts taken by the government of Nepal to create a more inclusive society by formulating deliberate policies which allow vulnerable groups to be part of decision-making in matters affecting their rights and freedoms. We also commend Nepal for taking steps to build capacity of key stakeholders in the promotion of human rights, including law enforcement agencies, by encouraging human rights-based approaches in their operations. Malawi recognizes ongoing policy and legislative reforms initiated by Nepal in order to comply with recommendations, most of which it accepted. My delegation encourages Nepal in opening up civic space, which is in line with its people-centered approach to human rights. Madam President, Malawi recommends the adoption of the UPR report on Nepal. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the Philippines for a video statement.
Chair, the Philippines warmly welcomes the delegation of Nepal to this session. My delegation acknowledges Nepal's constructive approach to the UPR process and recognizes its acceptance of the majority of the recommendations received during its third UPR cycle. We thank Nepal for accepting the recommendations presented by the Philippines on poverty reduction efforts and addressing gender-based violence. We note Nepal's committed efforts to align domestic legislation on migration to international standards, in particular the ICRMW. The Philippines supports the adoption by the Council of the UPR Working Group report on Nepal. We wish Nepal every success in the implementation of all the accepted recommendations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And the next speaker on the list is Qatar with a video statement.
السيد الرئيس في البداية يرحب وفد بلاد.
Firstly, my delegation would like to welcome the delegation from Nepal. We'd like to thank them for the information that has been provided. And this is an important contribution. My delegation welcomes the positive cooperation from Nepal in the area of human rights. In particular, the right to development and the implementation of the National Development Plan to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We also commend all the measures taken by the government towards the impoverished, the elderly, children, the disabled, and those who suffer from the abject impact of COVID-19. Mr. Vice President, Nepal has accepted the majority of recommendations, which confirms once again their commitment to promoting human rights in all areas: civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. We wish them success, prosperity, and we recommend the adoption of the report. I thank you.
The next speaker on my list is the Russian Federation with a video statement.
Madam President, we welcome Nepal at this third cycle of the UPR. The Russian delegation notes with satisfaction that Nepal has accepted almost all recommendations made to it, including Russian ones. We congratulate Nepal on the adoption of the new provisions of the Constitution. The adoption of this document signals a fundamental step in settling the conflict, which has lasted for 10 years. In this context, we note with satisfaction the review of domestic legislation with a view to more effectively implementing constitutional provisions in practice, as well as upholding the international rights obligations of the country. We note the successes made by the government in Nepal in promoting and protecting human rights and its readiness to cooperate with the universal human rights monitoring mechanisms. We wish Nepal the best of success and recommend the adoption of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Sri Lanka with a video statement.
Madam President, Sri Lanka commends the engagement of Nepal with this Council during its third cycle of the UPR in January 2021. We appreciate Nepal's acceptance of a majority of the 233 total recommendations received from members and observers of this Council. We thank, in particular, the acceptance of all 3 recommendations made to Nepal by Sri Lanka. We welcome Nepal's commitment to further enhance measures to uphold the human rights of people in terms of its constitution, and we recognize Nepal's efforts at poverty eradication and ameliorating the living standards of its people. Sri Lanka recommends the adoption of the third UPR report of Nepal and wishes the government of Nepal success in its implementation. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Tunisia for a video statement.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation welcomes Nepal and thanks them for the updated information provided. We have taken careful note of positive progress made in the area of promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms and the incorporation of these principles into the Nepali national legislation. We have taken note of the new National Development Plan 2020-2025. We also note progress made in the area of prohibiting discrimination towards women, the combat against violence towards women and girls, and tremendous efforts to combat human trafficking. And we recommend the adoption of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the United Nations Population Fund for a video statement.
Thank you, President. UNFP commends the government of Nepal for supporting many of the UPR recommendations it received. We welcome the firm support of the government to advance the commitments made at the Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25 and the emphasis placed on protecting the reproductive rights of young people. This includes support for upscaling adolescent-friendly health services and integration of comprehensive sexuality education in schools. UNFP applauds the enactment of the Safe Motherhood and Reproductive Health Rights Act in 2018, which calls for non-discriminatory access to sexual and reproductive health services on the grounds of age, marital status, disability, caste and ethnicity, and sexual orientation and gender identity. However, we recognize that structural barriers and discriminatory social norms make it challenging to implement this strong normative framework. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has compounded existing inequalities and disrupted access to essential reproductive health and gender-based violence services. UNFPA stands ready to support the government of Nepal in realizing the Nairobi Summit commitments. We commit to working in close partnership to achieve a more inclusive and resilient path towards a better future for all Nepali people. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Venezuela on Zoom.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We'd like to thank the distinguished delegation from the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal for their presentation. Their government has fully cooperated with the UPR. We noted the efforts by the country to implement the accepted recommendations in this second cycle of the UPR. I congratulate Nepal on achievements made in the area of education, which is mandatory for primary and free until secondary. People with disability and low income have the right to free secondary school education. Similarly, we applaud the fact that the government has made free of charge basic health services like vaccines, maternal and infant health, and pediatric services. Mr. Vice President, Venezuela commends the government of Nepal and encourages it to strengthen its targeted social policy with a particular emphasis on the most vulnerable. We wish them full success in the implementation of the accepted recommendations in this third cycle of the UPR. For the aforementioned reasons, we recommend the adoption of the report. I thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Let me remind you that all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should be uploaded online. And now I will give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The first speaker is the Swedish Association for Sexuality Education.
Thank you, President. The Swedish Association for Sexuality Education, RFSU, makes this statement on behalf of Visible Impact from Nepal. We welcome the adoption of the UPR outcome of Nepal and express our gratitude to the reviewing countries for emphasizing on protecting the rights of the vulnerable groups and to Nepal for accepting most of the recommendations. Nepal made a strong statement at Nairobi Summit on ICPD Plus 25, placing emphasis on investing in adolescents and youth and ensuring that they are able to exercise their reproductive rights. However, young people in Nepal continue to be denied access to sexual and reproductive health, services, and education. Therefore, we highlight Iceland's recommendation to implement the commitments made at the Nairobi Summit. Human rights obligations should not lessen during pandemics. The rising cases of gender-based violence, child marriage, menstrual seclusion, mental health outcomes, along with disruption of essential sexual and reproductive health services and limited access to comprehensive sexuality education, especially among young people, rural youth, persons with disabilities, sexual and gender minorities during the pandemic, is a clear indication of urgent need for resolute action. We welcome Finland's recommendations to combat the harmful practices. President, the clock is ticking and there is little time left for achieving the SDG FP 2030 or ICPD Plus 25. Therefore, we see the government's support for most recommendations as a sign of its strong commitment to human rights. We, youth and civil society organizations, stand ready to work with the government and monitor the full implementation of the UPR recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is the Consortium for Street Children.
Thank you, Chair. The Child Labour Action Research Innovation in South and Southeast Asia Consortium, which Consortium for Street Children is part of, warmly welcomes the Government of Nepal's support for recommendations on the enduring issues of the worst forms of child labour in Nepal made during this International Year for the Elimination of Child Labour. Our program in Nepal primarily focuses on the worst forms of child labour in the adult entertainment sector, collecting life stories of children working in this sector and generating innovative solutions based on this evidence through a participatory approach. Several recommendations were made to ensure that child labour in the informal sector is fully incorporated into the Child Labour Act. This recommendation was also made under the second UPR cycle, and we asked the government to act swiftly to address this issue. Our evidence shows that worst forms of child labour are predominant in the informal sectors, which are generally outside the purview of government regulations, pushing children into higher vulnerability. We are pleased that the government of Nepal has supported the recommendation made to ensure the inclusion of vulnerable children and families in policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic in order to minimize the risk of children getting involved in child labour. In our experience, this global health crisis has further exacerbated the situation of children who were already facing multiple vulnerabilities. We also welcome the government's support for the recommendation to develop safe and inclusive mechanism for all children to express their views and find a solution for the worst form of child labour. Our program has meaningful child participation at its core. We strongly believe that children involved in the worst forms of child labour in Nepal have innovative ideas that can generate sustainable solutions to the issue and stand ready to support the government in listening to them. We once again welcome the government of Nepal's support for these important recommendations and commit to use the evidence generated by our program to work collaboratively with the government to ensure their effective implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the World Evangelical Alliance for a joint statement to be delivered on behalf also of another non-governmental organization.
Madam President, we thank the government of Nepal for engaging in the Universal Periodic Review. We regret that key recommendations related to freedom of religion or belief were not accepted. The government of Nepal stated in its response to the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review that religious conversion by force or undue influence or inducement is prohibited to ensure the full enjoyment of religious freedom by every religious denomination. However, it is our observation that the opposite is taking place. Criminal charges of conversion by force or inducement are used to hinder the enjoyment of religious freedom. More than 30 Christians were arrested and taken to court on charges of conversion during 2018 and 2019. The Criminal Code states that no one should encourage religious conversion and that no one should convert a person by disturbing the religion or belief of any ethnic group. This wording is vague and has been conducive to arbitrary application and misuse. We therefore reiterate our appeal to the government of Nepal to repeal or amend sections 155, 156, 158, and 159 of the Penal Code, so it is consistent with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Freedom of religion and of conscience is a precondition for human development and the flourishing of societies. Thank you.
The next speaker is Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Madam President. CSW welcomes Nepal's cooperation with the UPR process. We regret that Nepal has chosen to note a recommendation by the Netherlands to amend Article 26 of the Constitution to include the right to choose or change the religion or belief of one's choice in accordance with Article 18 of the ICCPR. In its current form, Article 26 endangers both the right to freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. We call on Nepal to amend Article 26 to remove the prejudicial definition of secularism and instead include a definition which conforms to international human rights standards and refrains from the preferential treatment of one religion over others. We also regret that Nepal has noted recommendations made by Norway and Denmark, which respectively call for the removal of restrictions of the right to freedom of religion or belief contained in the Criminal Code, and for the repeal or amendment of sections 155, 156 and 158 of the Penal Code. We urge Nepal to reconsider accepting and implementing these recommendations as a matter of urgency, and to also implement accepted recommendation from Haiti, which calls on the state to protect the rights of religious minorities and guarantee freedom of religion or belief in law and in practice. As alluded to in the WEA statement just now, current provisions severely restrict the right to freedom of religion or belief and have sparked a marked increase in targeted attacks against Christians since the Penal Code's promulgation by both state and non-state actors. Notable is the case of Pastor Keshav Rajacharya of the Abundant Harvest Church, who was held from March to June 2020 on unfounded charges of outraging religious feeling and attempting to convert, despite having paid exorbitant bail amounts. While the pastor has since been released on bail, he is awaiting a final hearing of his case, and the charges against him remain in effect. We call on Nepal to drop all charges against Pastor Keshav Rajacharya and all those detained in connection with the peaceful exercise of their religion or belief immediately and without condition. Finally, we urge UN member states to continue monitoring the progress of Nepal in implementing recommendations to the advancement of human rights. The work does not end here, and follow-ups throughout the cycle are crucial to ensuring the process retains any gravitas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list of speakers is the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women.
Thank you, President. For makes the statement on the Asian Resource and Research Center for Women and right here, right now, Nepal, in collaboration with the Sexual Rights Initiative. We welcome the government's acceptance of recommendations on decriminalization of abortion and the protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights of all, to universal access to quality and adolescent-friendly health services and the full integration of comprehensive sexuality education for all. However, we are deeply concerned by the inattention to the issues on the existing statutory limitations of rape cases and discrimination against sexual and gender minorities, including the refusal to adopt marriage equality legislation. The existing provisions of citizenship and binary definition of marriage impede sexual and gender minorities from enjoying their fundamental rights to citizenship, employment, and marriage. Necessary amendments are required in the definition of marriage, and mandated medical reports need to be eliminated from the provision of Citizenship Bill. With the statutory limitations of 1 year for rape case registration and the rapid rise in rape cases during humanitarian crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, it is urgent that the government eliminate this provision. We also urge the government to ensure stronger commitments for youth sexual and reproductive health and rights and the implementation of Safe Motherhood and Reproductive Health Rights Act 2018. We call on the Ministry of Education and its constituent bodies to develop and implement a comprehensive curriculum for both in and out of school settings that aligns with international technical guidance on sexuality education. For the ambitious goals to be realized, it is vital that young people are meaningfully involved in the planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the national plans and programs. We also urge the government to enact policies to ensure meaningful and inclusive youth engagement in all the advocacy and accountability processes and to safeguard everyone's access to sexual and reproductive health services and information across the country. Thank you.
I thank you. And now I give the floor to the Center for Global Non-Killing.
Madam President, dear human beings, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear people and delegation of Nepal, greetings of peace and understanding. The Center for Global Non-Killing wishes to thank the delegation of Haiti for making a recommendation on suicide prevention. We congratulate the government of Nepal for accepting it. We say or recall that worldwide, suicide kills more than homicide. This tells us that the need to respect and protect our own lives, as the one of others, is vital. We will follow up on implementation. We note with pleasure that all recommendations made regarding the local Enforced Disappearances Commission have been accepted, yet we remain certain that a visit by the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances would be useful, and we hope that Nepal will complete its dealing with the past process and will ratify the Enforced Disappearances Convention as soon as possible. The Center for Global Non-Killing and Conscience and Peace Tax International note with pleasure that numerous states made recommendations regarding the Peace Constitution, at least in its international aspects, however, with mixed results. We recall that the Peace Constitution has also national aspects included in SDG 4 and 16, such as peace and nonviolence education, inclusive societies, or further, the local promotion of peaceful settlement of disputes, and the duty of prevention of all forms of violence. May life and peace prevail. Thank you, Madam President.
The next to speak will be the IDPC Consortium.
Madam President, this statement is delivered on behalf of religious community in Nepal. There is an estimated 130,000 people who use drugs in Nepal, including 39,000 people who inject drugs. The National Policy for Drug Control 2006 and National Drug Control Strategy 2010 underscore the need to protect the rights of the people who use drugs. However, the reality falls short from this commitment. The 1976 Narcotic Control Act, still in force, criminalized the use, possession for personal use, and addiction to drug. Discriminatory law has been a major barrier to protect health and human rights of the drug users. According to our 2019 survey showed that half of the people who use drugs have been arrested for drug use or related offenses. Although government supports harm reduction program, the police frequently harass and detain people, visit them. Treatment for drug dependency is available only private facility is expensive, which is operated without training, authorization, approval, and many cases of death, torture, and ill treatment have been reported. Women who use drugs are disproportionately impacted by stigma, discrimination, which is amplified by patriarchal norms and gender stereotype. Madam President, many of the recommendations provided by the member states UPR are relevant to the situation of people who use drugs in Nepal. That includes recommendation develop comprehensive discriminatory law policy to ensure the anti-torture legislation aligned with the international standard, the further access to health, the several recommendations to eliminate inequality, structural violence against women. We call upon the government of Nepal implement these recommendations with the view of respect, protect or fulfill the rights of people who use drugs, taking into the account specific need consideration, including their meaningful participation in policy making. Thank you.
The next speaker on my list is the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Madam President, we welcome that Nepal has accepted several recommendations related to the protection and promotion of freedom of expression, assembly and association, as well as protection of human rights defenders. However, failure to accept recommendations on some of the most pressing concerns related to these rights raises questions about Nepal's commitment to ensure their protection in accordance with its international human rights obligations and its constitution. We are concerned that Nepal has rejected recommendations to reform the Electronic Transactions Act and eliminate criminal provisions relating to defamation and slander. The Electronic Transactions Act has been used to restrict freedom of the press and prosecute, arrest, and detain journalists, members of the public, artists, and musicians for legitimate online expression. Similarly, the new criminal code includes several provisions that impose undue and broad restrictions on freedom of expression. While these long-standing concerns remain and previous recommendations remain unfulfilled, the government has proposed several new legislations such as the Information Technology Bill that would further erode freedom of expression with vaguely defined restrictions and criminal offenses. We urge Nepal to reform all existing laws and ensure all proposed legislation related to freedom of expression are in line with international standards. We further urge Nepal to decriminalize defamation. Finally, the recent appointments to the National Human Rights Commission of Nepal through a flawed process without transparency, broad consultation, or parliamentary approval undermines the independence, legitimacy, and public confidence in the Commission and contradicts the accepted UPR recommendations. We call on Nepal to rescind these appointments and ensure appointment and selection process, as well as the Human Rights Commission Act, are in line with international standards. We further call on Nepal to publicly set out an action plan for the implementation of UPR recommendations in cooperation and consultation with civil society. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Lawyers for Lawyers.
Madam President, Lawyers for Lawyers and the Law Society of England and Wales welcome the decision of Nepal to accept the recommendations related to lawyers and human rights defenders made during its third UPR. We call on Nepal to effectively implement these recommendations without delay. Protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms requires effective access to legal services, which can only be provided by an independent legal profession. Fundamental to improving human rights for the people in Nepal is a justice system that allows lawyers to work independently without fear of undue interference, harassment, or intimidation. We have noticed with grave concern that there has been an increase in threats against lawyers and human rights defenders, as well as other efforts to prevent them from carrying out their professional duties. Moreover, Nepalese lawyers have reported that insufficient measures are taken to guarantee the confidential nature of meetings between lawyers and their clients. In addition, lawyers are often prevented from communicating with their clients. The general lack of trust in law enforcement agencies amongst lawyers and defenders has worsened due to the failure to adequately investigate attacks against them and the overall impunity that ensues. Those who file complaints against state agents are especially at risk of violence and intimidation. There is a particularly high risk for women lawyers and human rights defenders who are defending victims of gender-based violence. Defenders in such cases are rarely brought to justice, and state authorities often fail to provide adequate protection to lawyers and human rights defenders. We therefore urge Nepal to take immediate measures to ensure that sufficient safeguards are in place to guarantee the full independence of lawyers and human rights defenders and their effective protection against any form of undue interference in their work. Thank you.
And the next speaker is the World Vision International.
Respected everyone, Namaste from Nepal. It's me Mandira Shrestha, the team leader of child-led UPR process in Nepal. I am one of the luckiest child who got this honor to submit the first ever child-led UPR report in behalf of children from all over the country. And each of us are very proud to be part of it and complete this historic task, being the collective voice of children from all 7 provinces. For this, I would like to thank Nepal government for supporting and accepting our recommendations, and also thanks for their commitment towards the promotion of conducive environment for the betterment of child rights in Nepal. However, there are still some critical places where Nepal government has to put special attention on. Firstly, there should be policy level programs and decisions for the abolishment of social evils like Chhaupadi, and more priority should be given for the health and nourishment of the vulnerable populations. Secondly, the focus should be on child-friendly education, and emphasis should be given on teacher-student relationship. The learn without fear approach should be implemented in every school. Moreover, government should immediately rescue the vulnerable children, including the child laborers and street children, and they should be provided with basic education and the health services. Also, there is need of proper guidelines for the meaningful child participations, and government must ensure that children and students are not used for any politics or their election purposes. Last but not the least, the government should decide the best major interest determinations of children at risk or those in need of special protection, along with the sexual and gender minorities as well as the children with disability. Overall, the government should develop and invest in the standpoint of children at 3 tiers based on proportionate justice approach. After all, we children are present rather than the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of Nepal for concluding remarks, allow me to note that based on the information provided, out of 233 recommendations received, 196 enjoy the support of Nepal and 37 are noted. I would like to give now the floor to His Excellency for his concluding remarks.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, at the outset, allow me to extend my gratitude to all the UN member states and all our stakeholders for their constructive engagement in today's meeting. We commend their encouraging comments and suggestions to Nepal. We'd like to reiterate our commitments to implement the accepted recommendations through an action plan under a dedicated mechanism. The recommendations are being integrated with our national plans and policies, including in our ongoing 5th National Human Rights Action Plan 2020-2025, as well as in the process of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Nepal, as the state party to more than 24 international human rights instruments, including the 7 core ones out of 9, remains committed to the promotion and protection of human rights. Nepal has earnestly implemented the accepted recommendation and made progress in the field of human rights following its previous reviews, despite several challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, poverty, and other socioeconomic constraints. We are determined to making good progress in the implementation of the accepted recommendations before our next review. The government of Nepal considers that the noted recommendations require further assessment on the existing implementation capacity, development of requisite legal policy and institutional infrastructures, along with the provision of necessary resources. Nepal regards civil society and the media as indispensable partners in the democratic society, contributing to the promotion and protection of human rights through a participatory and consultative process. Mr. Vice President, Nepal believes that all human rights, including the right to development, as universal, indivisible, interrelated, interdependent, and mutually reinforcing, which merit equal emphasis at all levels. We are steadfast to building an egalitarian society founded on proportionate, inclusive, and participatory democratic order to ensure economic equality, prosperity, and social justice by eliminating all types of discrimination. We are committed to the rule of law and good governance at all levels. We thank all the UN member states as well as civil societies and stakeholders for their engagement during the UPR process of Nepal. We wish to express gratitude to all those involved in this review process, including the Troika members, India, Burkina Faso, and Argentina, UPR Secretariat and UNHCR officials, interpreters, and the technical teams. We extend sincere appreciation to Human Rights Council President and the Bureau for the efficient stewardship of the successful conduct of the third cycle review of Nepal's UPR, as well as the arrangements made for the consideration of the outcome report today, despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We regard UPR as a unique, highly constructive and cooperative mechanism of the Human Rights Council that promotes dialogue, cooperation, transparency, and mutual learning through the sharing of good practices and experiences in the field of human rights. We express our unwavering faith to the UPR process, and we are looking forward to engaging in the days ahead. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency for this presentation and for the constructive participation of Nepal throughout the UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopts the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Nepal as it appears on the screen. I see no objection, and the decision is adopted.